Mr. Speaker, I wish to join my colleagues in asking that the National Assembly supports the budget that has been presented. And I shall briefly outline some of the reasons why we make this request. But I could not help but listen to the last presentation made by the Honorable Member, Mr. Roysdale Ford. And we have a context in which we are presenting this budget. Mr. Ford needs to understand that APNU AFC has, since November 2018, spent $419.2 billion without parliamentary oversight. A significant part of these resources have been squandered and whittled away through corrupt practices. $419 billion spent without parliamentary oversight, an unprecedented situation in any part of the Commonwealth where the Parliament has not met for such a long period. And why did it not meet? It's because of the criminal-like behavior on the part of the APNU AFC government and administration when they refused to comply with the Constitution of Guyana and use the court, tried to use the court to keep them in office illegally. Luckily, the Caribbean Court of Justice wiped the floor with APNU AFC. And because of the Caribbean Court of Justice and international pressure and the fight of the people of this country, we first of all got an election held, and then we finally had democracy prevail. So that is the first context in which we are presenting this first budget of a new PPP civic administration. The second thing is that for the first time in our history, we have been sanctioned. There are individuals who have been sanctioned in Guyana and may face further sanctions internationally for trying to steal an election. And some, I dare say, Mr. Speaker, that some of those sanctioned individuals may be current members of the National Assembly. Now, this is unusual. Very few countries in the world have had a situation where individuals have faced international sanctions for trying to steal an election. But here in Guyana, among our midst, we have some of those. Thirdly, Mr. Speaker, we've heard a lot of talk about fraudulence and from the Honorable Member, Mr. Roysdale Ford. But this government has had the endorsement of the entire world. The Organization of American States, made up of the countries of the Caribbean and Latin America, CARICOM, the OAS, the ABC countries, the European Union, I dare say the world has recognized the PPP civic government as the legitimate government in the world, in Guyana. Not a single country in the world, any part of this world, recognizes APNU's claims to be having won the elections. In fact, we are very familiar with the saga of how they attempted to steal the elections and then use the court to endorse that stealing. And right now, they have warmly embraced individuals who are before the courts and who will go before the courts for trying to steal the elections. These are individuals who work in GCOM. Mr. Speaker, I couldn't help listening and realizing that the Honorable Mr. Roysdale Ford has a great affinity for the use of the word fraudulence. And I believe he's very familiar with that word in the context of what took place at the Gaming Authority. And much more will be heard about this. This administration has just started its term a few days ago when the Parliament convened. But over the course of the next year or so, there shall be a number of investigations, and the country will be shocked by the revelation of fraudulence and high fraudulence involving high officials of the former regime. So the Gaming Authority, even from our preliminary findings there, we found a lot of fraudulent transactions, requests for bribes to issue licenses, etc., and more shall be heard about that soon. Mr. Speaker, even now, we're coming to terms with the magnitude of the fraud in fuel smuggling, where large billions of dollars of revenue were stolen because of wide-scale fraud in the fuel sector involving a number of officials, including former high officials of the former regime. Just a few days ago, the Army's internal audit pointed out that over $300 million of fraud has happened through the Gael transactions, but fraud and fuel smuggling at high seas, etc., will be exposed soon. Mr. Speaker, what is well known now as a key feature, in fact, it's one of the defining features, we have spoken about this in opposition so much as a characteristic of the APNU AFC government, is bid tampering. Bid tampering, illegal approval of contracts, splitting of bids, hiring friends and families and party supporters, and giving them large sums of money. Just last year, we saw an enormous sum or number of these happening, and an investigation is also pending in this regard, and the country shall hear more about this. Mr. Speaker, if you go to the criminality that took place at Nissel, you will see the large-scale transfer of resources, criminal transfer of resources, and many high officials of the past administration are neck deep in those transactions themselves. Transfer of billions of dollars worth of land, whereas not a single cent has been paid, but the properties have been vested in the names of individuals. This is criminality of the highest extent, and you will hear more about this. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Ford, therefore, knows a lot about the use of the word fraudulence, but I think it's misdirected. He should use it more in relation to the regime that just demitted office. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Roysdale Ford spoke about societal collapse when the PPP has been in office. And I wish to point out to the honorable member and other members of the National Assembly that what has characterized APNU PNC rule has always been the theft of elections. We had 3 decades of undemocratic rule, and then when this country loosened the grip through a return to free and fair elections that they had, the stranglehold that they had on the country, our country saw the development of independent institutions, including the judiciary, which was subjected to executive control in the past, and the other branches of the government started flourishing. We had a free press. The economy developed. The economy grew. And I don't want to belabor the point, but if Mr. Rosedale Ford, if he were to just look at the economic history of the country and look at all the parameters in which you measure economic development, from stock of debt, debt servicing, the inflation rate, interest rates, the balance of payment figures, fiscal deficit, you will see that in the 23 years tenure of the People's Progressive Party, that the People's Progressive Party took a bankrupt country from 1992, where the Caribbean Council of Churches and the entire world recognized was as poor as or even poorer than Haiti, and by the time it demitted office, left a middle-income country. And they, by their lack of economic policies, were taking us down. Had it not been for the oil and gas sector, would have been taking us back into the ranks of poor country if they were allowed to stay in office. But thank God they were removed from office. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to respond to some of the points made by the Honorable Member Rosedale Ford, because I think he was reading the wrong section of the budget when he talked about all the sectors of our economy doing well. He should look at the picture of the non-oil economy for this year, and every sector that he mentioned that has demonstrated a positive growth, all of them are in deficit. Every single one of them will record a deficit. And these are the sectors that create employment for the majority of Guyanese. Not the public sector, but the private sector. The majority of our people are employed in the private sector, Mr. Speaker. And therefore, you have to support private sector growth if you want our people to be employed and to enjoy a great standard of living. Mr. Speaker, the problem with APNU AFC is that they had no economic policy, and therefore they were always floundering in the wind. They had a disjointed approach to economic development. I believe that they felt that every cent in sight that was saved by the People's Progressive Party and that are in the pockets of the taxpayers, that they had to spend on themselves. And this was the tragedy that we had. Therefore, what took place in the last administration is a policy based on taxation and consumption. No, absolutely no economic policy. The budget is a tool of economic policy. And if you have no economic policy, you cannot understand the budget. So let me make it clear. The People's Progressive Party doesn't believe that collecting more taxes is a sign of progress. It is not. We believe that creating jobs and welfare is the right path for the country and economic growth. I shall spend a few minutes outlining the economic policy of the People's Progressive Party government, the government. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, APNU AFC had no welfare policy. You could not have a welfare policy and then dismantle the Ministry of Labor. You couldn't have a welfare policy and send home 7,000 sugar workers and put them on the breadline. You could not have a welfare policy and take away $1.6 billion from our children through the cash grant. Could not have a welfare policy and take away $600 million of benefits from the pensioners through free water. You could not have a welfare policy and then tax medicine, which ordinary people have to buy, or tax hinterland travel or freight into the hinterland. You could not have a welfare policy and increase fees by 500%. And so the same vendor who spoke with Mr. Roysdale Ford, that vendor now and the vendors in the past would have had to pay under the People's Progressive Party in 2014 a licensing fee of $12,500 to do vending, say, from a small vehicle. They increased the fee to $65,000, Mr. Speaker, from $12,500 to $65,000. Now the vendor would have to pay half of that. That is how you help poor people. So I can go on to point out how their policies were anti-poor and also anti-growth. And you may ask me, where did the money go, the huge taxes they were collecting? Well, public sector employment for cronies, friends, families, like the SARA group, made up of the top SARA members, were not people who had skills in forensic audit. All of them were politicians. Look at the top individuals who were there. That is why they spent billions of dollars without recovering any state asset. And of course they were illegal. These institutions were created to spend billions of dollars more. So the public service employment grew from 2014 to 2019 by some nearly 10,000 more individuals were added to the Ministry of Finance payroll. 10,000 individuals from about 34,000 to over 43,000. Mr. Speaker, that is where the money was spent. Government grew. They increased employment, cronies, families, friends, paid them higher salaries, renting more buildings to put them out, put them in, $1 billion more spent on that. More vehicles were purchased, more food to feed them, Mr. Speaker, $1.6 billion more per year food. That is their welfare for themselves. Whilst the ordinary man, the vendor, the taxi driver, the sugar worker, the bauxite worker had to contend with paying higher taxes on water and electricity and medicine and foodstuff and pay higher licensing fees. And the farmers had to pay for their fertilizers and pesticides and their machinery and the entire productive sector. Whether you're in mining or forestry, you had to pay taxes on your bulldozers, although you were importing these things to create wealth for the country and jobs for people and income for them. You had to pay more taxes, whilst this cabal just drove around in an arrogant way, trying to steal the resources of the country, transfer large amount of resources to lands and survey and everything else to themselves, and just had a great time in government. They had a great time in government. Well, all of that era is over. And I can understand the sadness on their part because the gravy train has come to an end. The gravy train that they're accustomed to has come to an end. And we intend to ensure that the government is competent, that it's properly staffed, that the excesses are taken out, and that the money goes back to people. It through lower taxes, the money stays with people in their pockets that they can spend more. So that the people who are working out there, people who are creating wealth for this country, that they want to spend, the productive sectors of the economy, the ones who generate value or services and export those through hard labor, that they're the ones who will also get to keep some of the benefits of their hard labor rather than these individuals, this parasitic group that sat in government for the last few years, just imbibe of the people through higher taxes and the people's earnings. That is what took place in the last regime. And then criminally try to disenfranchise them through serious measures. Mr. Speaker, bravado cannot substitute for analysis. And what we have there is a ton of bravado on the other side, reinventing, as Mr. Nandalal pointed out, the honorable member, the reinventing of the narrative. They reinvented the narrative so many times in the 5 months period. And it's that reinvented narrative and the adherence to it that promoted some of the current members into the National Assembly to the detriment of the others, because their adherence to propagate the reinvented false narrative. And so they're doing it again, trying to rewrite history. This is the 5 years tenure of this government. The last government has been disastrous. In 1 month, about a month, we've shown more coherence as a country in every single area. We promised these measures that we've implemented in this budget in our manifesto. We keep our promises. We promise them not because of just simply because we wanted to, but because we knew they're vital for an economic policy to take hold. You have to have an economic policy in mind. The economic policy says you cannot tax machinery and equipment, cannot tax imports, cannot tax exports, and you have to ensure you cannot drive up the cost of production by putting VAT on water and electricity. You're going to kill industries. So they believe that forever people will be there to pay taxes. But if the industries are dead, you can't raise taxes to pay public servants or to implement your social and policies, take care of health and education. That is why we offered a package of concessions, and we have no apology for trying to help the productive sectors of this country, that whether they call it private sector or not. These are Guyanese individuals who work. The people who would benefit from this are the people who work in the stores and in the market and everywhere else, not the cabal that was squatted in government for a while. Mr. Speaker, the last government had no environmental policy. So it was a pathetic presentation from the honorable member Kemraj Ramjatan, who has a vague understanding of the concept of the Green State and also the concept of the low carbon development strategy. When he talked about, they took off some taxes here on vehicles, so you can use, you can bring in greener vehicles and use tires and old vehicles, that these are the instruments of an environmental policy. It's such a pathetic understanding of an environmental policy in a modern world that is linked to economic development. Mr. Speaker, these policies are defined globally. The Paris Agreement, and it is clear that countries like ours make our contribution, but we are not the major polluters of the world. If you look at Guyana's case, we are a net carbon sink, and we have to leverage our assets to bring money into this country to support economic development. And the good thing is that we have a great environmental assets through our forests, but we have great needs on the adaptation side because of sea defenses and so many our vulnerabilities because of our low-lying coastal plain. And that is what the LCDS sought to do. It sought to earn resources from our forests, which we earned $250 million. They squandered some of those resources. Then Norway eventually had to put the whole last tranche on the hold because of the lack of democracy in Guyana. And even now, we have started re-engaging Norway to move forward again. The Green State strategy was a sham. They farmed it out to the international consultants, was not grounded in the Guyanese reality, and could not have solved our problems, was not a policy that generated green jobs, etc. They killed the Amila hydropower that would have been in place now, solving all of our electricity woes, with the cost of electricity being about half of what it was. They killed all the big green initiatives in favor of planting some trees, etc. And then they criticize our policies on used tires and on bringing back vehicles over 8 years old. Those were done because Guyanese across the country now complain that many of them couldn't afford to use tires, but these guys in government, they were living on state vehicles. They didn't have to buy tires. And secondly, the mere fact that you import vehicle over 8 years old would allow us to drive down the cost of one of those vehicles for a young person trying to acquire a vehicle for the first time by about $1 million. Affordability was an important concept. Our emissions from transport is minuscule if you look at the global scheme of things, but they don't understand that. And so it was a disastrous attempt foray by the brief listen I had from the Mr. Ramjatan about our environmental policies. Mr. Speaker, the last government had no policy on oil and gas too. Not just no policy on the economic policy, no welfare policy, no environmental policy, and no policy to address oil and gas. That is why we had this disastrous situation. And it was utterly shameful for the Honorable Member Ramjatan to lay the blame for us on flaring, etc. We're an administration that is a month old. He distorted completely the person from the EPA, the gentleman from the EPA, claiming he was an environmental specialist. He's never had a chance to look at that person's CV. But the fact remains is that right now, the key issues that should have been dealt with in the licensing of LISA 1 and LISA 2 are being addressed as to how you treat wastewater and how you treat waste generally. How do you deal with flaring? These are issues currently being addressed as part of this permitting process, only because the PPP decided to review what they were already doing. Had the PPP not come into office, the license would have long been issued since last month, because as you know, they were severely criticized for hiring consultants who were part or who were worked with ExxonMobil before. And that is why we had to bring in, apart from the work done by those consultants, another set of eyes to overlook these issues. But apart from that, the entire oil and gas sector, they made a mess of the local content. For them, they just sat on their hands, did absolutely nothing, whilst the oil companies ran amok in terms of not employing Guyanese or spending money here. That will not happen. The PPP will change that. There will be legislation, not just a policy, but legislation to force oil companies to comply, to spend more money here, and to employ more Guyanese. Because we have to share in the prosperity in this industry, and that will be done. Secondly, they made a mess because many of them wanted to acquire land, Mr. Speaker, in the areas where the pipeline was going to land. And so from 2016, they made no decision. By now, we could have had a large facility, over 200 megawatts, powered by gas, that would have seen cheaper electricity, but no decision has been made. We put together a task force, and that task force would work swiftly to ensure that happens. Apart from redoing the sovereign wealth fund, repealing it or amending it to ensure that it's more arm's length, and greater criminalizing non-disclosure of receipts. You recall, Mr. Speaker, the whole country would recall that when the former finance minister was asked about the 18 million bonus that was kept out of the consolidated fund illegally for many years, he said he thought it was a gift. Well, it was not a gift. It was money paid to the taxpayers of this country, and that should be spent on the taxpayers. That will never happen again because we'll criminalize non-disclosure. Mr. Speaker, I can just go on. The last government was operating without any overarching framework. They had no policy in any one of these areas. So that is why they acted the way they did. Mr. Speaker, we will have to continue facing this sort of bravado, because when you have nothing to speak, you have no track record to run on, you have to criticize, and in an unthinking way, not in a clear-cut analytical way. And it tends to be very emotive, like fraud is fraud, a chant about fraud is fraud, when the whole world knows that you're the only fraudulent group sitting in the National Assembly now. They will be prone to sloganeering. And politicizing issues that should never be politicized because they could be harmful to the cohesion of our people. We saw the unfortunate situation where 2 young kids lost their lives, and then subsequently another one, Joel and Isaiah and Harish. And the parents, this is horrific crime. These youngsters were killed by monsters that we have to our entire country have to find and punish these unconscionable monsters who did these acts. Everybody condemned it. And then like vultures, they descended on the areas, on the genuine grief of the families, and tried to politicize the issue and look at the consequences, the escalation, and they wanted it to escalate more for their narrow political interests. And if you listen to the parents of the young people who lost their lives so tragically, the parents stood up as a beacon of hope and show what Guyana is about. And even other leaders who are not in the parliament because they're being wiped out by the opposition leader from being in parliament from the PNC, they stood up and took a principled stand that this is a criminal act and we must find people. But like vultures preying on people's grief, they, as I said before, they showed up trying to escalate the situation in our country to serve their own need. And suddenly, their concern people who had no concern about Afro-Guyanese in the tenure in office, who would appropriate $160 million Guyana dollars and give it to an agency controlled right here in Georgetown to a selected few. People who would never walk the ground or help a single person on the ground in the Afro-Guyanese communities, but used up resources dedicated for that purpose. They never, now they're concerned about that. When they took away money from the school kids, those were many kids in Afro-Guyanese communities who lost their 10,000 grand, or pensioners who lost their free water there too, or who had to pay more for their medicine. They were not concerned at that time about Afro-Guyanese. Now suddenly, conveniently, and in fact, Mr. Speaker, if you look at the people, they talk about private sector, the people who have been the biggest beneficiaries of the wealth of the last 5 years being given taxpayers' money, there are few individuals from the private sector, and many of them are not Afro-Guyanese. Many of them are not Afro-Guyanese. So to shed crocodile tears now, just to polarize our country, is disingenuous. Mr. Speaker, you cry about indigenous versus Amerindians now. They're hung up on the name. But what they did was decimated the indigenous communities when they took away $720 million from the CSO's program, money that was spent in the village economies. As soon as they got into office, people lost their jobs. Nearly 2,000 Amerindians lost their jobs. The biggest act of discrimination against Amerindians anytime in the last maybe decade or maybe 25 years in this hemisphere. Almost, if you look at the extended family, over 10% of the families in the indigenous communities were affected. They had no concern. The vendor who spoke to Honorable Member Roysdale Ford, who told him he can't afford a tablet now, but they took away the one laptop per family. That family would have had one. And they took away the solar panels from the indigenous communities too. So, Mr. Speaker, shedding crocodile tears now that you're out of office and the people have right-sized you, because they talk about right-sizing the sugar industry, Mr. Speaker. Right-sizing the sugar industry, those were the words of the Honorable Member Kemraj Ramjatan. But right-sizing meant that 7,000 families and maybe another 4,000 indirectly, 11,000 families working out to over 50,000 people were put on the breadline. For them, it was right-sizing. But they were spending more on eating in government and renting buildings than it would have taken to support those 11,000 families in subsidy. That is what they're doing. The bauxite workers fared no better. People in Ituni, you remember the placard in the past, we're hungry because they practically killed the forestry sector. Now the Forestry Commission is bankrupt. I can talk about the list of bankruptcies there too, Mr. Speaker. This is the record. And so the reinvention today is so pathetic, and it's apparent to any Guyanese who's listening now. This is an undemocratic group of people, and I know why they're behaving this way and why they want to stir trouble, because many are deeply fearful that because of their deep involvement in many of the things I've mentioned before and the investigations to follow, that they will have to face the courts and the justice system, and they would want to claim that it is discrimination. So they're not concerned about real discrimination. What they're concerned about saving themselves, because many of them know what they actually did. Mr. Speaker, many people call for us to engage. And we made it clear in our manifesto that we want to reach out and to have to look at our governance model. And we're committed to looking at this, a governance model that includes more people and addresses more concerns. But Mr. Speaker, you have to understand the dilemma we face today. There is no honest interlocutor on the other side. The people who are in Parliament today, many of them, were the ones who not only sought to steal the elections, but they have absolutely no remorse about it. And you see the arrogance about even the attempt to steal the elections. How could they reasonably be honest interlocutors? And that is what people are saying out there. How do you work with people who have no remorse about the role they played in trying to divide our country, first of all, but trying to steal a whole election? And then even the people from the party, the People's National Congress, that because of our long history together, both parties emerging even from the same party, even before our independence, there's almost been, although we came close to, in many times, to about talking, etc., about the future, but at least some of those people grew up in the party and they had at least a vision of where we want to go forward. But they have been decimated, removed in favor of people who could have stuck with the Reagan narrative. So the problem today, we face a huge dilemma that there's no honest interlocutor on the other side who commands people, the people of the country and the base. And we've seen that in the recent issue. We don't know whether the leader of the opposition or the chairman of the party is in control of the base. But somebody who, when the situation, even if you reach out and talk, when things get tough, as they often do, then would stand up, have the courage to stand up and speak the truth to their bases. And this is a huge problem we have as we move forward, because that is one of those issues that we want to deal with. I have no doubt, Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to address many issues. I'm going to cede a lot of my time now because the budget is quite clear. The measures that we've put in place would put billions back into the pockets of the people, not keep it in government through higher taxes to spend on government officials. The government will be shrunk back. We get out of all those expensive buildings that they hired from their cronies and shrink back government to a level that is competent and enough to manage the affairs of the people of this country. We'll have an economic policy that will drive growth and development as we did in the past. We've already outlined that policy. Many of the things that have been stuck in the system, within 1 month we have reprogrammed many of these things. You're going to start seeing swift movement in many of these areas. In terms of COVID-19, we had an enormous time. The fraud that took place of the $1.9 billion spent by APNU in that area, most of it was spent on the hospital. That today is mired in controversy because it was not transparent. Another fraudulent transaction, Honorable Member Roysdale Ford. But there's so many, I can't mention them here today. So we will try to get benefits for our people. Just today I emerged from a meeting just a few moments ago, trying to work to see that we're in the front row for the vaccine. Our capabilities have grown enormously, but the challenges are great. We're going to try as quickly as possible to put people back to work. We're going to try to make sure that testing and medication in the hospitals, that we can offer the best care. We're going to try to assist people directly in their home through grants, etc. We've already made significant changes so that there'll be greater working capital for our private sector to resume employment in these areas. These are all things that we're working on, but this is a challenge for the country. This is a major challenge, a global challenge, and we're tackling this challenge here in Guyana with the capabilities that we have. Mr. Speaker, I've not seen any major comment on fiscal or monetary or balance of payment policies. So it's very hard to deal with it from a technical level, except in the perfunctory mention of the words, not an analysis. The one thing that I saw that was mentioned by the former Minister of Finance was he mentioned the fiscal deficit increase. Of course, the fiscal deficit has to increase. If you're going to bring billions of dollars of rollover expenditure from 2019 and billions of dollars that were spent illegally in 2020, especially on capital projects, you're going to have a higher fiscal deficit. But the medium-term trajectory, the one that we've outlined already, will see the deficit reduce significantly and also see greater incentives to the private sector. Another comment of a technical nature that I saw, that he mentioned that when annualized, the revenue lost to the Treasury will be greater next year. And I made that point even before he spoke about it, that the tax measures, when annualized next year, would yield a bigger tax relief package for consumers as well as the private sector next year, and that's deliberate. We believe that people who earn money should keep more of it. Must not come to the government, all of it to the government, so that people who sit in government offices can spend up this money. And the honorable opposition leader knows about spending the money very well because of the excesses that the last government pursued. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to expect the same. I would take a friendly wager with members of the National Assembly that is the same tenure or the sort of speech we'll hear from the leader of the opposition. Nothing of substance, nothing on policy making, the essentials of policy making, no in-depth analysis of any of the policies, whether they're monetary or BOP policies. No vision as to an economic policy. The same thing. Oh, it's a private sector budget. It is, we did a great job. This is our budget. This is their budget, and they took away. In fact, Mr. Speaker, what we're doing is just resetting the clock here at the start, because these are lots of these things that we've done here, what they took away from people. So I expect more of an hour of presentation from the leader of the opposition that is vacuous, as most of the presentations have been, and that will continue to be political, but nobody believes anything that he will say, because the international community knows that you can't talk about anything else. If you, in fact, to just stand in the National Assembly, which should be an institution of democracy, and have the undemocratic credentials that many of the people who stand here on the other side have, that's almost like a contradiction. So, Mr. Speaker, it's an extremely short presentation. I just want to say my colleagues on on the government side have done an excellent job in highlighting the details of the budget, the measures that are in place for indigenous communities, for the sugar workers, for other productive sectors, for people, all of our people, regardless of their race, all the regions, for hinterland roads and for education and healthcare, and putting money back into our children's pocket and the pensioners' pocket. They have highlighted all of this, things that are alien to the other side. So I just want to join my colleagues in urging that the House supports the budget. Thank you very much.